because 4 years and we're still here. So our goal and our mission is to perpetuate and sustain the CHamoru culture and to try to find inventive ways to kind of bridge both those on island and the diaspora through technology and through all different means of being able to communicate and to educate. And so Teresita Guevara Smith is our founder, and I took over earlier this year. And we were small, and we have been kind of forging through this COVID situation, just like everyone else has. But we're excited to be able to previous years. We have been able to hold with Senor Bevacqua's leadership and his ability to always be a resource for us, been one of our biggest supporters since we've been in contact with him. And we've been able to hold a couple different online sessions. We started out with some language sessions, and then we moved into a CHamoru history session at the beginning of this year. And now we are moving into away from more of a classroom setting and going into somewhat of a lecture series session. So I'm very excited that we are moving into this kind of new arena. We are we like to think that we've really kind of helped in starting the online learning opportunities that have come up in recent years. So I don't want to take all the credit, but I do know that we were one of the very first ones to start using this platform. And
Truly
so we want to
truly mega, take a lot of it. Truly mega. Munga mamala, don't be embarrassed.
No, not at all. But we are just beyond excited and appreciative because Senor has been there with us from the beginning when we even had this idea of being able to reach so many people across the country, honestly across the world, because even in our first couple on online language sessions, we had some folks in other countries that were being able to attend. So we're hoping that this platform will continue to stick. We hope that we can continue to reach as many people as possible and being able to share information about our CHamoru culture. So the fact that you're here means that we've reached you in some way. So shameless plug, make sure that you're following us on Instagram, Facebook, on YouTube, and also we have a TMAP site. If you Google Håle Para Agupa, it will come up. And so we are just excited that you are going to go onto this journey with us over the next 10 weeks. Again, cannot say Sanamasi enough to Dr. Bevacqua for his support and for always, waiting for us to be like, okay, when is the next session? And so we're hopeful that at the end of this particular session, you'll continue with us on any other opportunities that we present. So again, I don't want to take up too much time. I'm going to turn it over to our online education coordinator, Travis Wells, and he's going to give a little bit of intro on this particular lecture series and some housekeeping items, and then we'll get you over to Senor. Just want to say, Dispenser, if you see me drop off, I have a 1.5-month-old son, and he's going to be hungry soon. So obviously, I don't think anybody wants to see my susu. So I will probably put myself on hiding my my photo. But thank you again, and I look forward to taking this lecture series with you guys. Travis.
Håfa day, everybody. I'm excited for everybody to be here today. Again, I just kind of want to quickly say a big thank you and a big shout out to Savina. Like she kind of mentioned, she's been really taking the charge on coordinating and like leading Håle Para Agupa, especially as a fresh mother. Again, I know it's a lot of work and it's a lot of stress, but we really appreciate her doing all this stuff, and she's awesome. So I just really want to quickly just kind of introduce. I know that folks are pretty familiar with today's course. It's 10 figures from CHamoru history that you need to know about. Just some quick housekeeping rules. Everybody's aware that this session is being recorded, that these series are being recorded, and so the recordings will start at 6 o'clock. And just to keep like voice or like noise reduction down and to be respectful of everyone's time and presence here, we ask that participants remain muted unless called upon by Senor or brought up by discussion or conversation, then just unmute yourself, say whatever you need to say, and then mute yourself again so we reduce the amount of feedback as possible. Lastly, I just wanted to say again, thank you to Senor Bevacqua for taking the time out of his enormously busy schedule with everything that he has going on island as like an activist, as an educator, as a father, as a business owner. So we really appreciate him making this commitment for our communities and our people and our culture. So yeah, I think without further ado, we'll kick it off to Dr. Bevacqua and to start us off with the first session on Fuuna.
Dang it. I was hoping for more time. Okay. Maybe you guys should introduce yourselves to give me a couple more minutes to work on my PowerPoint. Yeah, maybe you should quickly, not too quickly. Mga fanyadik na don't be too quickly. But yeah, if everyone, I know most of you, there's a few of you that I don't. No, wait, I think I know all of you, except for one person.
And Senor, real quick, I'll take up a little bit of your time, real quick, just to give some info for those, because I recognize a lot of people in this series as well that have been with us before. So we decided when Travis and I were discussing putting together this lecture series and removing kind of the classroom setting of it and making it more of like a and you can share information, and then we would be in a space where we could branch that information further out. So for those that have been in the classes that we've had before, we have always had class sizes that were, typically a bigger than this, up to 100 people. We decided that for this go round with the lecture series, we were going to, for the first time, because those of you that have been with us from the beginning, remember that we've never recorded our sessions. So we are recording this. And the reason why we are doing that is because we're going to release this lecture series on a weekly basis on Saturday mornings. Well, that would be Saturday in the US, later in the day for those on Guam. And we are going to hope that this series is able to be something that we can reach a broader audience. Obviously, within Zoom, we're limited in our reach with that. And so being able to kind of expand and having an opportunity for it to be, again, less of a classroom and more of a forum or a series allows us to be able to have a broader reach for those that are looking for this information. And so, you guys are kind of our guinea pigs because we're testing this out the first time around. And obviously, as long as we can keep Senor on the hook with us, hopefully this will be the first of many lecture series that we'll be able to put forth on a myriad of different topics, because we are very excited to always learn about Chamorro history. And we're still playing with the ideas of what future language classes will look like. So those of you that are looking for those that we've had before, we haven't done away with them. We're just kind of rethinking and seeing the best way that we can put that out there and have a better platform for that. So I just kind of wanted to give some context to what the structure of this series and why it kind of looks a little bit different than what we've done before. So dispensa's up, but I was taking up a few more minutes for you, Senor. Go ahead.
Oh no, Sidus Masin. I got one more quote to type up. And so actually, if you can just go around real fast, say your name and your family names, so we can kind of establish who all is here. And so
I can start.
Okay, go ahead.
Inaanhusi Savina Garner, Familian Daru Zen Nauta, Tau Dedadu Zen Bergata.
I guess yeah.
Inaanhusi Ufan.
Woo, telling si Lou Gehrig now. You sounded like Lou Gehrig.
Inaanhusi Lillian Cruz. No. Sumasaka Joe Santa Clara, California. Familian Bujak in a Tatal. and Shay.
I'm June Flores, the family of Kotla and Gochu, currently in Radcliffe, Kentucky.
I'm Linda Flores Crop, and June's my sister, so we have the same family. I live in Atlanta, Georgia, and I'm so thankful that we're able to have these types of classes. This is like the third or fourth one I've had, and that you're doing it so that others can do it at different time zones. Because sometimes the language course on Friday just does not work for me. But thank you very much.
My name is Lourdes Calvo. I'm currently in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and the Calvo family is pretty big, so I'm part of the Calvo that also had lived in Arahan.
Seduce Mossing.
My
Or I
name,
can. Oh, Vinny, sige.
my name's Vinny Calvo, also Prel, and that's my mom. So that's my family.
Biba. Let's see. I can go in the order of your boxes next to mine. So Emily, Hogo Pogo.
Adai, todus. I'm Emily Wood, and my mom's family. So my family is Matanani and Duenas, and I'm currently in Wyoming.
Biba. Senor Damian.
Buenas, soy Cândido Damian, yo tato Alabama y familiaku, familia Godzo, y dos sobrinos lo que mangai gini, pues si yo me hace en una fanzona.
Hogo mas, senor. Si Antoinette. Buenas.
Buenas dan hafade, todus hamzu, gohusi Gitza, Cleveland, Ohio. Familian Chungi, than Kapili, and we do have some Kotla. So I'm glad to be here.
Seduce Masi. Jessica.
My name's Jessica Simples, and my family is from Arahan, and I'm currently in Union City, California.
Seduce Masi. Lynn, Hogo Pogo.
Buenas and hafide, Guahusi Lynn, Apagui Arroyo, Sumasaka Gitza, San Ramon, in Bay Area, California. Familian Sueño, Bitut, Cantun, Cojo, Hula, Sismasi.
Hogo Mas. Seduce Masi. Clarissa.
Hafide, si Clarissa Mendiola too. Familian Monarch si Nanahu, and Familian Vincentico si Tatahu. Tautau Barragata and Telefofutsu. Sumasaka Giza, San Francisco, Ramatish Ohlone territory. Nice to be here.
Seduce Masi. Leah.
Hafide, Naan Husi, Leah Gogui, Sumasaka to Giza, Temecula, California. Tau Tau, Sinahanya, Familian Bita. My mom's family is Bamba, but I don't know what our family name is.
Seduce Masi. Benny, Senor Benny. Y maestro.
Ay, algumas. Ko si Benny Tanatongo Anderson, sumasakadu dito San Francisco, California. Familian Godzu, Tauta Nalan, and familian Doma, Tauta Melissa.
Seduce Masi. Travis. Or I guess you already introduced yourself. Or Hadzi Familia Mune.
buenas inan si Travis, tau agate and jigu, zanzigozu, familian tourists and sablon mungafin, bakuluds and mungafin dongatzu. So.
Sidus Masi. Senora Cruz, Florence.
Buenas. Inanyas si Florence Cruz, familian Bujak, Che, Calvo, and Samasagaju in San Lorenzo, California, and Jet Lucy Lillian Cruz.
Hungan Itzelun Cruz, Hungan. Sidus Masi. Christine Hafading.
Hafade, buenas and Hafade Todosamsu, si Christine Flotrosu, Sumasagatsu Giza Pittsburgh, na Siadot, Tata Haganya Heitsu, Soti Zen Seli Ifimlaku.
Sidus Masi. And Teresita?
I think Teresita stepped away for a second.
Oh, okay, so. Kika. Kika Hoban? Oh.
Half a day.
Oh, half a day?
Namu si Francis Young, y familia Juan Chino, then Paris Gozu. Now, my mom used to live in Santa Rita, but now she's in Manila, and I live in Reston, Virginia.
Sidus Masi. And then there's Valerie Salas and Sidus Masi Valerie and Heidi. Buenas, Heidi.
Hafade Studio, Hafade Sodas Tamsu, si Heidi, Paris Mandel, Takalef Kenga, Tautau Parisville, Familian Godzu, Tato Inalahan, Zan Carabao, Tautau Piti.
Sidus Masi. Right. I'm happy. I'm happy that all of you have gathered, and I look forward to the 10 weeks that we spend together. As you all know, inonhusi Lujan Bevacqua, Milian Cabezas and Bitut. And I want to thank Jauna be Sangani Sidus Masi Nuesti Grupo Håle Para Agupa. Thank you, Håle Para Agupa, for always being willing to create spaces and to connect people across great distances for the betterment of sort of the Chamorro people. And so don't worry, you can't get rid of me, especially now that Chuck E. Cheese is closed down on Guam. I don't have anywhere else to go or nothing else to do. And so I just have to teach these types of classes. Just kidding. But Lo Maga no, Chuck E. Cheese is closing down. Dididi Tristizu, because I like to play video games. But and so this class, so if you took the Chamorro history class that I offered under Håle Para Agupa, there will be some overlap. But the focus is different. For that class, it was very much about difference of those time periods. But for this one, it's focused around different figures. It's focused around different figures. And so we will cover some of the same things. You may hear some of the same stories, hear some of the same words, but the focus will be very different. Now, of course, there's of course way more than 10 people that I could teach this class through. But 10 is a nice number, and 10 will keep it from becoming stale. Like if I said 34 figures from Guam history that you should know about, some of you might go running for the hills, or some of you might wait until it comes out on Netflix or something like that and check it out then. And so, but 10 is a nice number. I thought about doing 13, but that would be a longer, because 13 is the number of months in the ancient Chamorro calendar, but I said 10 is okay too. 10 is okay too. And so I have in my mind the 10 that we will be talking about, but I have a feeling it's going to change. And so the first one for today is locked in, but after that it may change based on our conversations and based on how the class goes. But I do have in my mind the 10 figures that I think I'm going to talk about. And so bear in mind, that's the disclaimer, that we will not cover everything. There will be things that are not mentioned. And we also have to take into account that history is not written in any equal or comprehensive sense. History in terms of what is known, what is documented, and so on. And so in terms of Chamorro history, that does hurt female figures more than male figures, as we will talk about today. But that's why it's important that for the first figure that we begin with, and can I share screen, quick for what?
Hungen.
That's why we have to definitely begin with Fuuna as sort of our first figure. It says a disabled participant screen sharing.
Okay, dispense. I think that's an easy fix.
Okay. Or you can make me a co-host. Or if I can't share the PowerPoint, that's fine, because I didn't finish it. I just wanted to get some quotes in for you guys, so it would be easier to follow. Håle Para Agupa is the host now. There we go. There we go. All right. And so I did not get it. And so my hope is that eventually I can come back later when I have a little more time to sort of finish this up, and fill in some of the gaps, because there's not all the slides are finished, but I wanted to focus in on some of the quotes, because we start with Fuuna because everything begins with Fuuna. Fuuna and Puntan, the Chamorro creation story. And in this, we're going to talk about the story itself, the meaning of the story, but also the persistence of sort of what you could call the spirit of Fuuna, or the symbolism of Fuuna, through things such as Chamorro female identity, Maga Hog, the Maga Hog sort of value, the Maga Hog sort of impulse, and so on. And so that's where we begin. And it's a great place to start, because Fuuna and Puntan, this is the story that the Chamorro people told at the arrival of Europeans, at first contact with Europeans. This is the story that they told of where they come from. And there's different sort of accounts of whether Chamorros believed that it was the creation story for everybody, or whether they believed it was just their creation story. You will find that sometimes the Spanish wrote down accounts that said that Chamorros believed they were the only people in the world, which we know is simply not true, because that they had connections to other islands. They had knowledge and connections to other islands, and so clearly Chamorros knew they were not the only people in the world. And so sometimes these stories, and there are lots of different accounts about Fuuna and Puntan. There's different versions of it, and the version that we tell nowadays is different than the oldest versions that we have of it, because the oldest versions that we have of it are very heavily laden with Catholicism, very heavily laden with androcentrism, with sort of a male emphasis on the story to de-emphasize the female aspects of it. But ultimately, we go back to Fuuna and Puntan, and we go back to the beginning. And so this is the cover of the Guam Legends, the CHamoru Legends book that UOG Press released last year. And it depicts some of the elements of this story. So in the beginning, there was nothing in this place that we now call our home. It was empty space. But there was something that breathed here, a great beauty for the possibility for the future, but it had yet to be realized. There was two great beings, a brother and a sister, who came from afar to this place, and remarking even in the emptiness, but seeing and marveling on the possibilities for this place, part of this was from necessity. For the brother, Puntan, he was sick. The journey that they had taken had made him ill, and he could feel that his time was short. And so he asked his sister, Fuuna, that when he died, if she could use his body to create something in this place, to create sort of the dream that they had seen for the future in this place. And Fuuna, of course, sad to be left alone, she agreed. And after her brother Puntan passed away, she began to carry out his last request. And different versions will tell us different things about what she did. But the most important elements are that the back becomes the sky, and the body becomes the land, and that the two eyes become the sun and the moon, ipilan zeniatdao, and that the eyebrows become the rainbows, the isa. And some say that the hair becomes the clouds. Some say that even something as silly, there is one account that says that his dodo, his farts, become the thunder in the sky. And that same account also says that his metme, his urine, becomes the ocean. Hence the acidic nature of the ocean, perhaps, I guess. And so when Fuuna had created all of this using her brother's body, she was sad. And all of that expenditure of energy, all of the effort that she had put into that task had also drained her. And she could also feel that her time was coming short. And so she decided not just to complete she decided to use her own life to complete the vision that they had had for this place. And so she used her energy to fill the ocean, to fill the waters with life, the skies with life. And that as she placed her hands over her brother's body, which was now an island in the sea, she created trees and animals. And with the last sort of bit of life that she had, it descended into sort of the ground on the island around her. And she became this rock. So this rock is supposed to be the body of Fuuna, known as La Sofua or Fua rock. And so from the rocks and from the sand around this rock, her energy mixed with them. And the first Chamorro people emerged from that mixture. And so this is a very important story because the Spanish took note that Chamorros love to tell this story. And in fact, that at great parties, and that the largest gathering that we know of from the Spanish period took place at Fua in Guam. And so Fray Antonio de Los Angeles, he came a few years before Fray Juan Pobre, and he was in Guam, and he noted that the largest gathering, that the Chamorro people believe that they are born from a rock, and that they go to that rock each year for a large party. And in the next century after that, there was more accounts that talked about this being the largest gathering, and that Chamorros would even come from other islands sometimes to this place. Although there are stories that actually each island in the Marianas had their own version of the Fuuna and Puntan story. It's hard to tell. But ultimately, this was a very important place, and that each family took pride in telling this story. That the stories of the creation of the people was something that would be told and recited at every party. And some Chamorros even admitted that they didn't understand a lot of the stories that they told because they were so ancient, but that they still had to recite them because it was tradition, because it was who they are. Now, so when thinking about this story, origin stories are an interesting, a fascinating sort of thing, because they're very rarely ever factual stories. And this goes for even modern societies too. There's always an element of myth. There's always an element of cultural expression in origin stories. And we can absolutely see this with the Chamorro origin creation story as well. That even if you don't necessarily believe that Fuuna and Puntan were great beings that created us and created the island, there's still important cultural knowledge that exists in that story. And especially for Chamorros at that time, at the time of Spanish contact, the knowledge that came in those stories was very important because it was a reflection of the people and their values at that time. And so a few things that stand out in terms of understanding how that story reflects it provides a snapshot of the culture at that time. It provides a snapshot which helps us understand what was of value, what was the cosmological sort of coordinates by which Chamorros saw themselves in the world, saw the development of their culture. Origin stories oftentimes are an explanation for why things have come to the way they are, interestingly enough. They're a story about why you have this relation to this person, or this class is related to that class, or these people are tied to this land. And so in the Chamorro creation story, the first thing that stands out, of course, is Idostetlu, the brother and sister. And that is something that we see reflected in ancient Chamorro life, is that clans were governed by a brother and a sister. It was not sort of that the oldest male and his wife were in charge. It was not even necessarily that the oldest alone was in charge, but it was that the oldest brother and sister, who were related through women, that they were in charge of a clan. This also extended then to sort of a village as a whole, that a village would be governed by the Magalahi, or the male leaders, the oldest sons from the different clans in the village, and the Maga Hog would have their own council of those who were the female leaders from their clans. And so this is important, because some creation stories often begin with procreation, with a male and a female who are joined through sort of love or through sort of reproduction. But the Chamorro creation story begins with siblings. And we see that reflected. And it comes about, interestingly enough, in the sense that your siblings, and we see it in culture at that time in particular, that who you are related to is far more important than who you're married to. And so there is a Micronesian saying which says that your husband or your wife is your outrigger, but your siblings are the hull, which means that you can always replace your husband or your wife, but it would be a huge hardship to try to replace the hull of your canoe. A reminder that, and so from this we find that for Chamorros there was a strong value of siblings needing to work together, that the family needed to, that those who were related by having parents like that you had to work together, and that as long as you were able to work together and cooperate, the family would prosper. But of a strong de-emphasizing of your marital relationships. Secondly, an emphasis on sacrifice. An emphasis on sacrifice. That creation stories, there's a spectrum in terms of how power is used in creation stories. The level of omnipotence, the level of sort of strength, and sort of the invincibility of those involved. And that has an impact then on how the culture sees itself. So cultures that tend to have all massive, all-knowing, infinite, invincible gods tend to also then create cultures which lack respect for limits, because the idea of God is infinite. And so there is then this feeling, there is then this disjointedness with the natural world. Cultures which tend to emphasize sacrifice then tend, as we can see in sort of the Chamorro creation story, that there is a stronger emphasis on the need to work hard. There is a need, not that something comes for the next generation by working hard for it and by giving up something for the next generation. And we can definitely see that. We can definitely see that across time, across generations, that emphasis that even your parents must sacrifice, even your spirits must sacrifice, that nothing comes cheap, nothing comes easy, nothing comes for free. And then finally, another element that we can see from this is just the way that the story then is laid down in the land. The way that the island of Guam becomes not simply land, but it is the body of one of your earliest ancestors. And this is important because sometimes we will say that Fuuna and Puntan are gods. You'll say that Fuuna and Puntan are gods, but they're not really gods. When you look at closely at the story and how it evolves, they're the first ancestors of the Chamorro people, because our essence, our energy comes from the spirit of Fuuna, and our ability to survive and prosper comes from the generosity of Puntan. And so if you think about it, they are not gods, but they are those who have given birth to us. They are our ancestors. They are our elders. And this then reflects the fact that Chamorros didn't have a religion in which they believed in huge pantheons of gods, as far as we know, but that their sense of the spiritual world was much closer. They believed that the world was filled with the spirits of their ancestors and the ancestors of others, and that therefore their religion was developed around respectful behavior in order to keep your ancestors happy. Respectful behavior, good treatment of the family in order to keep them happy so they would continue to protect the family, so that they would keep the family safe. So we can see that in this is that Fuuna and Puntan are not big, huge gods that look down upon the people, but instead they are like your nana and your tata. But I mean, yeah, I guess it is kind of similar in that way. But this goes even to the extent of how then Chamorros understood how spirits were anchored into the world. Because when somebody died, you buried their bones in the land of your family. And if you did that and you kept the spirits happy, then the spirit, the Aniti, the ancestral spirit, the Aniti stayed with the family. And so that idea then of your ancestors being in the earth, that they are in it, in the bones of the earth, we see that manifested in, of course, the taking of bones and the using of bones by ancient Chamorros as spiritual anchors to keep their Aniti with them, to keep their connection to them strong. But we also can see it then in the story of Puntan and Fuuna, in the sense that Puntan himself is our first ancestor, is the ground. He is in the earth. And so we can see that most notably in the middle of the island of Guam, in which the names of the villages that stretch across the middle, sort of, I guess, where his waist and his stomach might be, they all have names connected to places in the middle of the body. And so going from one side, Barrigada, which is a Spanish word, but it's the Spanish word for your side. And of course, your side in Chamorro is Calagwak. And if you are from Barrigada, then you know that Halagwak is actually the older name for Barrigada. But at some point, the Spanish name for the side overtakes that. So most people use Barrigada today for their side, but you still find on maps Halagwak Street. And sort of even the US Navy identified that area as Halagwak before World War II. So it is spelled with a J from the Spanish, but then the word in Chamorro is Calagwak. And so moving then, you have Tidzan, which is of course your stomach. Tidzan comes from the word Tudzan. And then you keep moving and you have a place like Toptu. Toptu refers to the back. Toptu means to lie on your back. And then you keep moving and you have Mongmong. And Mongmong refers to your heart. Mongmong is the sound of your heart beating or the beating of your heart. And then even Hagatnya, some people argue, is tied to that because Hagatnya possibly refers to the blood. And so in the middle of the island, you have all of these places with names. And if you are very familiar with your place names on Guam, you'll find lots of other ones which have ties to body parts. But so this is part of that story. that feeling that Puntan is in the land, you are in the land, your ancestors are in the land. And this then creates a very strong sense of attachment to the land, a reverence for the land. And it is something which then successive sort of, not until the 20th century did Chamorros really start to let go of. Because during the Spanish period, Chamorros did not want to leave their land, did not want to sell their land, always wanted to hold on to their land. It's only later that they start to sort of let go of that. But this idea, this attachment, this connection that your ancestor is in it, your ancestors are in it, it persisted even after Chamorros stopped actively believing in their Aniti for a time. So, but one of the most interesting theories about the Fuuna and Puntan story, and now take note, this is just a theory. And it's a theory that I find kind of interesting. It's also a theory that Leonard Iriarte, the master chanter, he also likes to talk about, because we have to remember that where the accounts of the Spanish end, our imagination does not need to end. It is not for Salvatores to tell us who we are. It is not for an anthropologist or historian to tell us who we are. Your history, your identity, your sense of peoplehood, there is always an element of cultural creativity and cultural imagination involved. And so we can engage in those things. And I encourage us to all the time, because you shouldn't let the fact that Salvatores, for example, didn't like Chamorro women, let him dictate then what Chamorro women are in history. And so one of the things that's very interesting is that you could try to connect the story of Fuuna and Puntan to the first great voyage in human history. And so always remember that Chamorros can take credit for that first great voyage in human history. And some historians, not a lot, but some historians call it that because it's the first known voyage into the open ocean that humans ever undertook. So humans underwent voyages across land, they spread out, they settled areas, but you can't necessarily tell exactly how they happened. You can kind of create a general sense of population movement and migration over time. But for the Marianas, you can and it was approximately 4,000 years ago. 4,000 to 3,700, somewhere in there. But it was at that time, and humans may have traveled the open ocean before that. We don't know, but we do know that the open ocean voyage that settled the Marianas was successful because the people made it, and the people settled, and they lived there for thousands of years. There may have been other migrations, there may have been a lot of other things, but we do know that it happened, and there's evidence. And thinking about that, I think if all of us were to get into a canoe and try to sail from Indonesia to Guam now in a canoe, it'd be pretty impressive, don't you think? It'd be pretty impressive. I mean, you could try to use your app on your phone to get us there, but the app can only tell you so much or do so much for you. But if you imagine what it would have been like 4,000 years ago, when something like a map, like a simple map on a paper, didn't really exist for most cultures. That actually at that time maps would have been drawn on animal skins, they would have been drawn on cave walls, and they would have been in songs or stories. And so 4,000 years ago, that voyage took place. And the theory that connects Fuuna and Puntan to that is that the story is not just something that reflects cultural values, but it is perhaps something that began as a story recounting that journey, and then eventually it became more mythological. So according to that theory, Fuuna and Puntan were the male and female leaders of that voyage. And that perhaps what happened is that on the voyage, Puntan died, and that he was the first one buried in the new land. And it's possible that coconuts were brought with them, because it's likely that coconuts were introduced by humans at that time. and that when they buried him, they also planted the first coconuts. And part of this theory then is that the names Fuuna and Punten may come from the words Fotna, which means front, and Punten, which is a ripe coconut that has fallen on the ground. And so that's the theory. And it's a very interesting theory. And if you wanted to connect it further, there's the story of Chaifi, the legend of Chaifi, and you could even say that might be a story about who Fuuna and Punten were trying to escape from wherever they came from. Because Chaifi is a jealous god who keeps the people in prison, souls imprisoned, doesn't want to let them go. And that they escape, and then Chaifi comes for them, but he finds that he cannot take them back. Because according to the story, their children had been given life by the sun and by new soil. And so Chaifi had no control over the lives and the spirits of their children. But so now that is just a theory, but it's fascinating to think about. And if any of you are feeling creative, you could totally write the story of Fuuna and Punten. Dude, it would be better than Moana. It would be so much better than Moana. It would be so much better than Moana. Moana made me kitan. It made me cross-eyed when I watched it. Because it was like, hey, that's Samoan. Hey, that's Maori. Hey, that's from Tokelau. It was like, because they were using all of these different Pacific things to create this like mishmash. Oh yeah, definitely, absolutely. And so, okay, now, so one of the important things about this though is that from this story of Fuuna and Punten though, we also understand how Chamorro culture then evolved and how power was distributed. Because Chamorro culture at the time of ancient life and at the time of the contact with Europeans was matrilineal. And so sometimes people mistake matriarchal and matrilineal. Now, Chamorro culture was not matriarchal because matriarchal is a society in which women dominate men, right? But we see that it was more so that power was distributed, but that the culture was absolutely matrilineal. And so matrilineal means that sort of there's a primacy for female relatives in terms of tracing your lineage. And so that was absolutely true. But it also means then that women are symbolically more important in society. And that women are seen as having more value socially. So that even if the male, a husband may be the head of the family, the woman is actually the more powerful one in the family. So that's why you wouldn't call ancient Chamorro society matriarchal, because men were still in charge of many things. But we see that women still had incredible symbolic and real authority over lives, over their lives, their bodies, their families' lives, and society in general. And this is something that the Spanish were afraid of. They did not like it. They did not like it because they saw that they would create special classes to try to indoctrinate the women to obey their husbands no matter what. And Chamorro women detested those classes. But so let's get into some of this stuff here. So in each family, the head is the father or older relative, but with limited influence. A son, as he grows up, neither fears or respects his father. Damn, just putting it out there. Neither fears or respects. In the home, it is the woman who rules, and her husband does not dare give an order contrary to her wishes, nor punish the children, for she will turn upon him and beat him. If the wife leaves his house, the children will go with her, knowing no other father than the next husband their mother may select. Damn. Ouch. That's like, ouch. That's like, stop following your father on Instagram. You're following my boyfriend now. But that's my dad. No, it's not your dad anymore. Unfriend him on Facebook too. Untag him on all photos. Erase all photos of him. See Jose over here. He's your new daddy. And so, so you can see that even the Spanish recognized that men were still, in many ways, the heads of things, but that women had not just power, but they had like real power. So that's so this is one of the things that I want to really highlight here, though, because we want to make a distinction between sort of the Maga Hog spirit in this time versus the way the Maga Hog spirit has persisted in the time since. Because you can definitely argue that it persisted, but the conditions and the context in which it persisted absolutely changed. And so one of the things here is, for example, we may say nowadays that, well, yeah, women still run the household. And we may say even 100 years ago, stories of my grandparents, that my grandparents said that their mothers ran the household and stuff like that. That's true. And even people who came after the Spanish recognized that women in Guam seemed to be more assertive. They seem to be have more power than sort of in other islands in the Pacific and in European countries. But what came with colonization were very clear limits on that power. And so, oh yes, so here, for those of you that were taking my history course, and taking the values course, one of the things that we talked about is the Maga Hog of Sidza. This is one of her mentions, one of her rare mentions. So the astuteness and courage of the islanders themselves served quite as well as the Spanish arms to rid the island of malefactors. This was started by a woman who governed insofar as the Marianos was self-government, the district called Sidza in the southern part of Guam. This noble matron was devoted to Christianity, counseled her people, who were already tired of constant unrest, to buy peace and friendship from the Spaniards by means of punishment of delinquents. Thus it was done. And so the Spanish didn't give a lot of, they didn't talk a lot about Chamorro women. They didn't like to give them their names, even if they did talk about them in glowing terms. And so even though they acknowledged the power of women, they hated to talk about it, and they rarely talked about it in positive terms. This is one of the rare instances in which they talked about the power of women in a positive sense, because this woman, who the Maga Hog of Sidza, she had organized her people to hunt down and turn in, sometimes cutting off their heads and turning in the heads of Chamorros who were against the Spanish. And so, but even though Salvatores and others highlighted her, they wouldn't give her name, and they wouldn't give much feedback. They wouldn't give us much information about her. And I would love to know more about her. And it makes you wonder too, because the village next door was against the Spanish. Perhaps there was a woman who led that village in the war against the Spanish, but because she was fighting against them, the Spanish wouldn't recognize her. And so this is the power of women at that time. And so we have to be careful when we read these documents, because a lot of times they will minimize it, or they will erase it, silence it. So this is one of the big, hold on. Okay. So another thing, so Chamorro women had power, sort of going in line with that idea that from Fuuna and Puntan we get a distribution of power, right? So that men don't have dominance over everything, women don't have dominance over everything. And so, for example, the spheres of life were divided into those that the men dominated and those that the women dominated. And so the women dominated, and they controlled and dictated the area inside the reef. So shallow water fishing was primarily what women did. And the canoe, open ocean voyaging, deep water fishing was largely men. On the land, both men and women engaged in agriculture, but women dictated the use of the land of the family. So men might be the ones who would clear the land, but it was his cousins and his aunts so on. In the home, the wives are given all the rights attributed to The husband's elsewhere. The woman has absolute command in the house. She is the mistress. She has all the authority, and the husband cannot dispose of anything without her consent. In the home and when it came to the children, a woman's power was absolute. And that irked the priests. And they tried to sort of find ways to get more women to stop feeling that they should have the authority and the right in the home. But here's another sort of example of the so if you're familiar with ancient Chamorro wedding cakes, ancient Chamorro wedding cakes were rice. They were cooked from rice. And when you went to an ancient Chamorro wedding, you brought rice with you, and that was your contribution for it. And so all the rice would be cooked into different small cakes or rice balls that people would get. And so the cake was first offered by the mother of the nuptial pair to their husband's eldest sisters. The wedding cake, which was constructed upon a special litter. Now, this was also the large wedding cake was like a pyramid shape on a large litter, which was carried by about 4 people on sticks. And it was passed by appointed bearers from person to person until it was finally received by the eldest woman in the family. She alone had authority to divide it amongst those to whom it had been presented. And so in all these ways, women were given this authority, this very powerful symbolic authority over things. But it wasn't simply symbolic authority. One of the ways in which we can see that women were valued more in society is the way that, and this is was the word of a woman. Even in feuds, women were accorded special treatment. If a woman was engaged in a quarrel, the whole clan took her side. If no one interfered in arguments between men. Lanyas, that's so sad. If a plea for assistance was directed to a male, he alone came. But if directed to a woman of the highest rank of a Chamorro family, all relatives, including the in-laws, had to turn out. And so this is important because what we see happens later is that Chamorro women still have authority in the house, but oftentimes that authority ends once you leave the house, and it's not even actually secure in the house. Because if, for example, there was a dispute between a man and a woman, in ancient times, the woman's word won. But in the time since colonization, oftentimes the man's word would dictate that a woman's word was not to be trusted because the system around her was patriarchal. The system around her was patrilineal. The system around her prioritized men, and that men were more essential. Men were more important. But in ancient times, a woman's word was more important, and a woman's value was more important. So that's an important distinction. Women didn't dominate everything, but the society accepted that women had to be listened to, they had to be heard, they had to be taken care of if needed. But that a man shouldn't be accorded the same respect, shouldn't be accorded the same value. And so we can see then that this is why the Maga Hog spirit persists. But what happens then is that the society that has emerged via colonization and Catholicism it constantly beats down and beats back that Maga Hog spirit. Because even if, for example, 100 years ago, if your husband was beating you and you went to the government wouldn't do anything to your husband, most likely. And your family might even tell you that it is your fault. Because these are the things that emerge, is that Chamorro culture had changed so dramatically, but it still raised strong women, but that the society around them was constantly trying to get them into smaller and smaller spaces where they could sort of embody that spirit. One of the things that freaked out the Spanish a lot was this issue. So they do not have many wives, nor do they marry relatives. If one can call marriage that, if they can call marriage that which might be better called concubinage for its lack of perpetuity. for they may separate and take another husband or wife at any trifling quarrel. Or if a man abandons his wife, however, if a man abandons his wife, it costs him a great deal, for he loses both his property and his children. Women can leave their husband without inconvenience, and do so frequently through jealousy and suspecting their husbands of disloyalty. They punish them in many ways. Sometimes the women who have evidence against their husband calls a meeting of all the women of the village who, wearing hats and armed with spears and lances, advance on the house of the adulterer, and if he has growing crops, destroy them. They make him come out of the house and threaten to run him through with their lances, at last driving him away. At other times, the offended wife punished her husband by leaving him. Then her parents spear or a mat on which to sleep. They leave nothing more than the mere shell of the house, and sometimes they destroy even that. If a woman is untrue to her husband, the latter may kill her lover, but the woman receives no punishment. Again, I mean, whew, this is I'm kind of scared for those Maga Hog meetings where the women get together and then they sharpen their spears and then they come to your house and holy damn. But now, some of this may be exaggerated because of the fear and the disgust that the Spanish had for it. But even if you just accept the basic structure of it, it shows you sort of that at that time, that Chamorro women were empowered and the community around them also empowered them, right? That it wasn't just window dressing. It wasn't just sort of like what we find oftentimes. And I remember one of my students, he did a thesis where he interviewed Chamorro men who were in the judicial system, who were spousal abusers. And it was an interesting sort of thing because all of the men pretty much talked about how they loved their mother because their mother was strong and their mother ran the house and their mother had the authority and you didn't cross their mom and stuff like that. But then all of them also talked about how their dads didn't treat their moms very well. Oftentimes their dads cheated on their moms. And then all of them also talked about how many of them didn't like Chamorro women because Chamorro women were too strong. And that's where you see that the distinction there, that Chamorro women are strong, but that patriarchy, patrilineal culture promises men that they're in charge. And like the priests who promised Chamorro men who converted after the Chamorro Spanish Wars, that if you convert to Christianity, your wives will do everything you say. That's the promise of the sexual contract. That's the promise of patriarchy, is that your wives are you're supposed to have authority over them. You're supposed to dictate them. And so it was a fascinating thesis that he wrote, where in his interviews it came out that a lot of these Chamorro men saw that their moms and their nanas were really strong, but the strength that defined them was not an active strength. It wasn't an enabled strength. It was a capacity to endure. It was menesmun. It was a capacity to suffer, to put up with things, to hold things together, even if you don't have a lot, or even if you're not treated that great. And then when they encountered a woman who they were married to or they were in a relationship with who embodied a different type of strength, they tended to not like it and find that it wasn't Chamorro. It was wrong. It was bad. And so we can see this from that time, that Chamorro women at that time, even to the point of their pleasure, was prioritized. The Spanish, so that idea that a woman could cheat on her husband, and it was permitted, because even the pleasure of a woman was more important than the pleasure of her husband. So nowadays, or so under patriarchy, right? The husband cheats. Sometimes people will even blame the wife or blame the spouse. But at that time, if a wife cheated, you blamed the husband, because the husband must not be able to meet her needs. He must not be able to handle that much woman. And so you didn't speak ill of her, you didn't punish her, but instead the man received shame And in some ways, it was you separate or you do better, but you don't get to hurt and you don't get to drag down your wife to make yourself feel better or to sort of even things out. The society says that your wife's happiness and your wife's safety, your wife's word is more important than yours. And so this is sort of the power of Chamorro women that comes about even if even after the Spanish even after the Spanish sort of clamped down on a lot of these things, we see Chamorro women still finding ways to adapt and assert authority, retain some power. And so we see it in the Spanish period, for example, and this is something that some historians some historians, they struggle with. One of the things that happens is that Chamorro women engage in prostitution with people that are visiting the island in order to make money for themselves or their families. And that men who visited the island, there was a culture of Catholic secrecy where you hid women away, but the women who went out in the early 1800s, the men, sort of different people that visited Guam said that the women spoke with authority. They would not let the men speak, that they dominated the conversation, that they were very assertive, they were very proud, they were very strong. And sailors from Europe and from America who saw that, they found it unique amongst a lot of the islands in the Pacific. We see it in different ways. Sort of this. One of the ways that you can see it is in the Tetsa, the ways in which Chamorro women try to preserve a place for themselves in the new sort of religious regime that is created. The Tetsa. Because a new Chamorro women, we don't know exactly, but we assume that they had roles in ancient religion. They must have. There's no reason to indicate that they wouldn't have had roles in ancient religion, that they couldn't be makana, or that they couldn't lead ceremonies, or anything like that. But what happens under the Spanish is that women are shut out from almost all of the things that they used to have power in. They're not supposed to be in charge of the home anymore. They're not supposed to be involved in religious ceremonies anymore. They're not allowed to sort of enjoy their bodies in the same way that they used to. And so recognizing this new religion, that it is male dominated, and that sort of the role of women is just to kind of kneel down and pray and not have any authority or power. We don't know how exactly it happens, but the Tetsa is somehow born along the way. And the Tetsa is not something the Catholic Church created. The Tetsa is a role that most likely Chamorro women created in order to continue to have some relevance within an institution which was determined to shut them out. Because the Tetsa is a community role. It is an expression of community, of community togetherness. And in recent years, the church has tried to dominate and dictate the Tetsa. They've tried to take credit for the Tetsa. The church says that the Tetsa now is a formal position within the church, but it's not really. They say that the Tetsa is an extension of the priest's authority, like the Tetsa is a messenger or an emissary of the priest in the community. But what used to happen is that the Tetsa oftentimes had more power in the community than the church did, at least on the everyday level. So, for example, the Tetsa, now, of course, some people will take issue with this. Some people who are very strong in the church might take issue with that too. But it is something that still persists in small ways nowadays. For example, when there's issues about when you're supposed to say prayers, or how you're supposed to say prayers, or when you're supposed to say prayers, like what time of day or night you're supposed to say prayers. The community followed the lead of the Tetsas, even as the church would send out dictates this or that. The Tetsa was often trusted more with that element, with those types of things, on sort of the practices, the rituals. The Tetsa was a very important sort of role in that. And so these are ways that we can see that what comes from Fuuna, which is this idea that women that women are sort of like this, that women are the energy of the Chamorro culture, that they're like, they give the heartbeat, right? That the man may provide the structure, the shell, but that the women make the heart beat and make the blood flow within the body. That persists. We see it in the Chamorro Spanish wards in the time of contact. We see it strong. We see that even afterwards, Chamorro women still refuse to sort of let go of that, and that's still refuse to sort of let go of that strength. Oh, it's okay. Wait, I know that I know we started late. Men were rarely tetsus during the, as far as we know. It's only more recently that men are more tetsus. But one of the things that's very unfortunate about the tetsa is that the word itself comes from the word comes from, most likely, the word tutsa. Tutsa is a word which means, it can mean to tear something, to like rip something, to penetrate something, but it is the word meaning to begin, as in to begin a ceremony. And so many people think that because of the tetsa's association with the church, it is a Spanish word, which is why you then had some male tetsas call themselves tetsos in the later 20th century, calling themselves tetsos. You got the tetsa, you got the tetso. That sounds so weird. No disrespect to any tetsos, but it does sound weird to me. It does sound strange. But yes, so, and all right, hold on a second. Oh yes, and so I wanted to end sort of because we see it more and more nowadays. We see with ideas such as, I love those the Futures Famalawan shirts, with the Maga Hog being elected, with women dominating the legislature. One of the most fascinating ways that we could see the power of women, or a comfort that people in Guam had with women with having more power, is the fact that in the Pacific in the 90s, the Guam legislature, and for much of the world actually, had the highest percentage of female representation in it. That in the 90s, there was one legislature which was 1/3 women. And that was higher than any place in the Pacific. And then more recently, with the election of Lujan Guerrero as Maga Hog, and the election of the quote-unquote legislature, where there's a female supermajority, that's sort of the highest. It's now, there's another statistic that says that Rwanda might have the highest ever in terms of female representation, but it's still quite high to have sort of 2/3 of your elected body from the people be female. It is a very big deal. And so we can see that even though there's these struggles between sort of the patriarchal nature of the United States, that it sort of the patriarchal culture that the US brings into Guam, the patriarchal culture that Catholicism brings into Guam. We see that despite that, there still is that aura of the Maga Hog. There still is that power. And so one of the things to think about, returning to the story at the beginning. So where Fua Rock is in Umatic, ancient Chamorros gathered there. It was their largest gathering. But with colonization and conversion, forced conversion, they stopped going there. They stopped having large parties there. But the parties that they had there were important there, those gatherings, because we know that they would bring offerings, that they would tell stories, they would have competitions to see whose family could tell the stories that went furthest back in their family line. They would debate, they would sing, they would bring food for their ancestors, and they would bring food for sick people in their homes and ask the ancestors to bless the food so that they could take it back to them so that their family members would be healed. They would leave offerings. But ultimately, going to Fua was connecting to their ancestors. It was about connecting to the Initi, respecting them, feeling their warmth and their protection in your life. But for hundreds of years, Chamorros didn't go back to Fua in the same way. They still believed, especially for the people of Yamatic, they still believed that it was a powerful spiritual place, but that it was a place where Tautomona lived. Although, even up until the earliest 20th century, women would still go there, but you didn't do this, like you didn't tell your church group you were doing this. But if you wanted to get pregnant, you might go and you might pray, or you might leave an offering at the rock, at Fua Rock. Or you might go and you might whisper to the Tautomona and ask for help. Because there was this feeling that the spirits there enhanced a woman's fertility. And that if she was having trouble conceiving, that going there and praying or making an offering would help with that. So it wasn't until about six years ago or so that there was a formal return to Fua. And so it was called the Lukau Fua. Lukau is the word, we use it most prominently nowadays to refer to a Catholic religious procession, right? The Lukau travels, the Lukau for the patron saint, where they carry the patron saint, right, on the altar and stuff like that. And so the procession, the Lukau Santa Maria Kamalin, is the largest one on the island, of course. But Lukau can refer to anything. It's not just it can refer to a parade, and it can refer to a pilgrimage. And so this was called the Lukau Fua as a pilgrimage, a return to the site of Chamorro creation. And so every year for the past 6 or so years, there has been a Lukau Fua, organized by different groups. First organized by the group Our Islands Are Sacred. Later, the group Independent Guahan. We took over organizing it each year. And sometimes 40 people go, sometimes 100 people go. Every year it's different. But on the sort of the start of the Chamorro year, which is the start of the lunar year, Tumaiguini is the month. That's usually when we have the Lukau that travels down there. And so people still bring they still bring gifts. They bring flowers, they bring rice, they bring necklaces and jewelry that they have made. It's a practice now that if you go on the Lukau, that if you want to give thanks or acknowledge an ancestor, then you should make or bring something in their honor. And so you can totally buy rice, like Calrose rice from the store if you want to. Sometimes people do that. Or you can bring plants from your garden. People did that. Or you can make something special. Because it's said that, especially for women, if to express the loss of somebody in ancient times, you might carve a necklace in honor of somebody, and then you might destroy the necklace in their honor. And so I bring this up because as we go through this history, one of the things that happens through colonization is that there seem to be these very severe and strict divisions. That's where the term Tautomona comes from. After colonization were completely different things. And because Tautomona refers to the people from before. And so Tautomona, now we think of it as spirits, but Chamorros during the Spanish period used Tautomona to refer to laddie stones and lusong and things, artifacts in the jungle. And if a Chamorro saw like a sinahi on the jungle floor, they would say, "Oh, Tautomona adzu, mapatsa, don't touch it. That belongs to the people of before." And so colonization creates those breaks, those rifts, in which you feel like you are fundamentally disconnected from them because somebody planted a flag in your lands, somebody forced you to learn a new language, somebody forced you to kneel in a new church. You can't remember the way that you used to do it. You can't remember the language that your ancestors spoke. And we often think of history as being like that, right? But that's not really how history works. So Chamorro's sense of history, as far as we can tell, is circular. And you can even see it in the word motna itself, is that motna refers to what is ahead of you, but also what is behind you. So tautau motna can refer to those who have come before you. It can also refer to those who are ahead of you in time. Because you can say, so gifinetna, motna, back, the first. But also you can say, tatsogue esti motna, tanamaulik esti motna. Motna referring to the future. When motna is applied to a statement like that, it means it reverberates into the future. It is not just done in the moment, it will continue on in time. And so we should always remember that as we learn about these things, especially as we learn about things which may not have been told to us, things which may have been kept from us, as we learn about culture, values, ways of connecting to the world and to each other, it is not that they are lost to the past. It is not that they are artifacts for museums. These are things which, if we feel that they are beautiful, that they are precious, that they are important, then these are things that we can revive. They are things that we can find again. These are things that we can live again if we want to. And so I want you to remember that as we go through the next 9 figures too, looking at these different parts of history and then thinking, because colonization makes it feel like you don't have any choices left. And that's not true. Decolonization is just regaining that ability to decide for yourself again, to look at the past and then think, yes, some stuff was lost and that's sad, but I get to decide what happens next. And so if I want to dance, then you can't tell me that Chamorros can't dance. And if I want to speak my language, you can't tell me that Chamorro's not a real language. And if I want to know my history, it's my history. It's not anyone else's to tell me that it doesn't exist anymore or it's not good enough. And so, Sidus Masi for listening to this first lecture with the unfinished PowerPoint.
Okay, Sanamasi. Okay, he wants to be a part of the class, but Sanamasi, senor. I appreciate the first lecture. I think there was a lot of good information, a lot of interesting perspectives on Chamorro women. So we appreciate it, and we look forward to the next class next week. Shameless plug again, everyone. Please pass on, let everyone know that this series will be available for view on Saturday. So check our social media platforms in order for you to be able to see it. And other than that, Senor, did you want to take any questions or anything else before closeout, or?
Sure. If anyone has any questions, I didn't mean to go that long. But yes, because I do want to try to make it so that there's some time at the end where we can, where if you have any questions. And I had meant to prepare some thoughts for discussion, and thoughts for reflection, like some stuff for you to reflect on, but I just didn't have time to. And so, are there any questions?
I mean, I know we cut into your time a little bit, so it's okay, that
no.
Went a little bit over today. But yes, if there's any questions, as long as people have time, Senor Saramasi, for making yourself available.
Yes. Does anyone have any questions? It could be directly related or it could be tangentially related to stuff that I mentioned.
Megan, I do have a question. Just in terms of the young scholars who are doing work on Chamorro history and diasporic relations, etc., I was just wondering, has anyone really looked into the way in which, particularly for the wives of Chamorro men who joined the military and left, how the disruption, the fact that not just the disruption in terms of the matrilineal children and cousins, assisting. It never occurred to me until, again, as you know, my parents passed in the last 3 years, and I continue to grieve them very heavily. But one of the things that occurred to me about my mother is my father was in Vietnam, like many other Chamorro men, although he was a radio man, so he was not in the fields. And I thought about how she would tell stories. We were in San Diego, and she would tell stories about how my younger brother and I had asthma attacks in the middle of the night at midnight. And she'd have to load 5 children into a station wagon by herself, and take everybody because she couldn't leave anybody behind. And that really made me think about how, this, my mother would not have been able to rely on first cousins or someone who could run over to the house, that kind of thing. So I'm just curious if anyone of the young scholars who are coming up have sort of looked at that, the way in which, and again, huge jumps, but huge disruptions in terms of militarization to how women related, the kinds of lack of support. Because we focus a lot on the experiences of Chamorro men in the military,
True.
right? And so women, our mothers, our grandmothers who did come into the diaspora really were put into a completely different situation where they could not rely on other women. So it wasn't just the line, it was also the lack of support that they had. So I just didn't know if you were aware of any young scholars who are working on that.
In terms of focusing on women, no, just men. There's just a few that talk about Chamorro men and military service, but
Right.
yeah, in terms of Chamorro women, no, it's definitely something that's I know that
Well,
Nicole Santos, who's not Chamorro but from Guam, she had wanted to talk about Chamorro women in the service in the Guam National Guard in her dissertation, but she never finished her dissertation. I know that the Humanities Council, Humanities Guahan, did their Sindalu exhibit, in which the focus was there was a heavy focus on Chamorro. There was not a heavy, but there was a significant focus on Chamorro women in service, but not on wives. Not necessarily on that.
Yeah. I see Lynn and Leah already waving their hands, so I can hear the response.
Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm actually finishing up my thesis on that in migration studies and looking at Chamorro women's experiences after World War II. So what's really interesting and what I found, I'm not finished writing it yet, but what I found along the way that I found like so fascinating in my interviews with my family was the relationship between, was that my grandmother, for example, her younger brothers would come and live with her to help her when my grandfather was away at sea. So this was, my grandfather was in the Navy in the 50s. So we lived in, my family lived in like Atlanta, Georgia, and Florida, Philadelphia, and then in California. And it just seemed like at least they had, my grandmother would, had a lot of brothers and they were younger than her. And whenever, my grandfather was away, a lot of times her brother would come and stay. And then I found that very interesting because it relates to our creation story, right? And how important that is and how we carry that. And then also in my family's experience, and I know that there was a lot of other military families like this, at least in the 50s and 60s, where there was very small, there were communities of Chamorros, right? Like in Alameda, like my mom was friends with the Castro brothers, their family in Alameda in the 50s. And so there would be like 5 or 6 families and they would come together and they would help each other. So I think in some ways it was very isolating, of course. But in other ways, I think that, we took strides into trying to make community or to find our communities, and then just really helping each other in that way. But yeah, so that was some of the things that was one of the big things that I discovered just in with my interviews with my family.
Yeah, just really quickly, one of the major differences, neither of my parents came from large families, which was an anomaly for that time. So I had a paternal grandmother who had reproductive issues, right? So my father only had two sisters, and then my mother was the child of her mother was the second wife of a father who passed earlier. So she was an only child effectively. She had half siblings, but had so many primas and primos on the island, but they wouldn't not necessarily, she was so much older, so they would not necessarily have come over. But that's a really good point, Lynn. I wouldn't have thought about that. That was specific to my family, right? And Leah, you were going to say something too. I'm sorry.
I could have ever said. But I do have a question.
What is your question? Sorry.
I'm thoroughly fascinated with this idea of like Chamorro women taking up space and like not giving up their strength. And this is a silly question, but I wondered if you could give like a description or depiction of like what is the quintessential tetsa and like what are their roles?
So the tetsa. Okay. So the main thing for the tetsa is that they say rosaries, they say novenas, they lead the prayers. Traditionally, tetsas can have a larger role than that too, because it's also a familial relationship. You know that like somebody may be your tetsa for a very long time, and that also in the past, for example, um, it's not necessarily as much the case perhaps anymore, but in the past, for example, young women who needed advice could ask tetsas. And sometimes a tetsa, even though they might be very Catholic, they might also be very they were sometimes also outsiders in an interesting way. Similar to the way a surahana could also be a very strong Catholic, but also be an outsider in the culture. And so the tetsa is, yeah, for me, and that's why it's unfortunate that the tetsa is dying out. It's unfortunate, or that that families just kind of do their own readings, and that a lot of times now the prayers are just done in English. And so you see then that sort of the power of the tetsa being diminished in a lot of different ways. Part of it also is just sort of the weakening of the Catholic Church in life too. But it was so, yeah, so there was something about that position, and it's not very, and one of the reasons why it's so interesting to me is that I'm not Catholic. So when I had to teach a class on the tetsa, I brought it at UOG, I brought a very different perspective to it, because for me, I wasn't interested in like just the stuff within the church. I wanted to talk about the tension between the church and the tetsa, because in different times there is because in a lot of communities, and it still happens sometimes, where the church will put out a schedule for prayers and the tetsas will say, no, that's not how we do it. And then they will just do it their own way. And then the church will find out that in villages, what they have put out there is not being followed. So this is where, if you're familiar with some of the issues in the church of the neo-catechumenical way, the neo-cats, as there was a lot of controversy on Guam about that. The church always has these two sort of, the Catholic Church in Guam, like anywhere, has at least these two main tracks. One of them is the Chamorro cultural track, and then the other is sort of the Catholic Church global track. And so the Chamorro cultural track is connected to the larger track, but you can see at certain times that as the church wants to change, the people don't want to change with it. And so if you're on Guam, for example, one of the main ways that happens most recently is with the litany or the prayer for San Vitoris, for Blessed Diego. So if you go to Mass, there's something towards the beginning where you're supposed to honor Padre Luis Diego Salvatores, who brought Christianity to Guam. And the church, like a decade or two ago, as part of the former archbishop's push, they wanted to really try to make Salvatores happen. And Archbishop Flores before him had tried it. Monsignor Calvo before him had tried it. There was always this emphasis that because Salvatores is this global Catholic figure, where he's a minor figure in the history of the church, we want to make him happen here. But what has happened ever since is that Chamorros largely don't care about Salvatores and don't like Salvatores, which is why if you're sitting in Mass, when it comes to the Salvatores part, a quarter of the people to a third of the people will not say it. And in fact, I remember I had one of the former directors of Department of Administration under Calvo. She came up to me one day and she's like, "Dr. Bevacqua, you are radicalizing my daughters," because I had her 2 daughters in my Guam history class, and I was like, "Oh, what? Did they jump a military fence? What happened?" And she's like, "No, they said they're never going to say the Salvatores part." When we go to Mass, they came out and they said, "Mom, we love our faith. We're strong Catholics. But after we know the truth of Salvatores, we cannot praise him for what he did." And then she's like, and that's happened for a lot of people. So you can see, and that's part of the Tetsa experiences that too, where the Tetsa is part of the community's expression of its Catholic faith, which is actually a lot more about your family connections and your village identity, your family identity, and less about sort of what men in robes decide on the other side of the world. There's this difference. And so in the past, the Tetsa had a lot of power where people, like for example, if somebody died and the church told you that you needed to do your prayers like this, you needed to bury them like this, the Tetsa might have more power in terms of telling the family what was right and what was appropriate than the church. And so ultimately, the church gets to decide how things go because the church controls the facilities and a lot of stuff like that. But there is oftentimes this tension. Like I've seen it. I had a student whose aunt was a Tetsa who didn't want to follow the new schedule for prayers, the new days they were going to have the prayers on. And so in retaliation, the church, the church wouldn't let them, they were from Jotnya, they wouldn't let them have the funeral in the Jotnya church because she had stood up and refused to follow what the church had mandated in terms of the prayer schedule. The church then decided to mess with a funeral in the family because of that tension, because the church sees the Tetsas as part of them, and the Tetsas are fine most of the time, but every once in a while, there's this other part of them. The fancy philosophical word is alterity. There's this alterity to them, where they absolutely exist outside of the church. And I'm all about those types of things because that's usually where sort of the part of the Chamorro which comes from ancient times is. There's this part of it that doesn't quite fit, right? Like the Surahano, they're part of the world we live in today, but it sticks out just a little bit, and that's sort of the part that Chamorros made for themselves and kept for themselves, even as the island was changing, they were changing, the culture was changing. They still worked so that there would be these markers of their past, of their strength. And so the Tetsa, like I see now, it was hard to teach a class like that because most of the students I had just wanted to learn how to say the rosary. And I was like, we're not going to say the rosary, we're going to analyze the rosary. We're not going to like learn how to say it and practice it. We're going to analyze it for sort of the language that's used, because rosaries often use very deep language because many of them were translated a while ago. But so that was weird for those students because I was like, no, think about like think about your Tetsa as more than just an old woman that you pick up and bring to the rosary, and then you give her a plate of food and then you drop her home. Oh, your Tetsa's there's a power in her. She represents something of the strength of Chamorro women. She is a sign that Chamorro women, at the time of colonization, they refused to let go. They said, we are going to have a place in this church. And eventually Chamorro women largely accepted the ways that the church offered them, but they never let go of this community voice for the people in the church. And yeah, and the church can't really deal with it. It's one of those things where it wants to take credit for the Tetsa, but it can't really take credit for the Tetsa. But anyways.
Dispensa, Senor, now we are seeing less and less requests for rosaries at the funerals or the pre-funerals. So the need for a techa is disappearing, and people are not asking for these rosaries anymore. We're seeing just a mass and the burial, and that's the end of that. But I have another request regarding you mentioned that some Chamorro women, when visiting men came, they would prostitute themselves. I was wondering, how were the children of these, the potential children, being dealt with in society? Because they, how were they treated? Could you address that?
That's a very good question. So as far as we can tell, Chamorro culture was very accepting of those sorts of things. Now, and we see that that's one reason why the idea of poksai, the idea of raising somebody's children who's not your own, it's a very strong value, right? Every culture can have that, right? You go stay with somebody, but in Chamorro culture, there was this really strong idea, right? That like if your auntie who has no kids asks you for one of her kids, you got to let her have it because, and so, so one of that, part of that though, is then just this openness, and so, we see then, we see that there's a lot of contradictions in the culture though, right? Because Chamorros are it's funny because I was reading to my son the other day, there's several versions of Cinderella in Chamorro. Yeah, again, no, comento se puede no. Again. And so as part of one of Akli's assignments, he had to type it up for me. And so it's funny because if we think about a Cinderella story, right? And there's different versions, but this is one of them. There's everyone would see her. She goes to church. And so she gets fancy clothes. She gets very fancy shoes because shoes were a very important indicator of wealth at that time. And so, and then she goes to mass and everyone stares at her. Who is this gorgeous woman in this beautiful dress at mass? And so, but the church was like the center of Chamorro life. It was where just about everything happened. And so it was essential, but at the same time, you could code switch in different contexts, right? So that was if you're familiar with the Kanten Samurita. The Kanten Samurita is a great way of understanding that code switching. For example, if you went up to your mother and said, Jose is really hot, I'm going to go make out with Jose. Your mother would probably beat you almost to death. And then when your father got home, she would say, Manette, and then your father would beat you to death again because you didn't talk about those things. You didn't express that type of stuff. But if you were at a party, even a fiesta, and you put it into a song that you were in love with Jose and that you wanted to kiss Jose, then your parents would laugh and they might even get excited about it because it's in a completely different cultural context. So that's the contradiction that Chamorros had in that is that on the one hand, they were very, very strong Catholics in some ways, and sometimes could be very dismissive, condescending, very, very, but then on the other hand, they also had that part of them that loved joking, loved very crude sexual humor, that loved, that loved life. But what had happened in a lot of ways was that there was your church side, and then there was your life side, your party side. And so the song was one of the best ways that you could switch that up. Was that you could express your love for somebody in song in front of the whole village, and people would cheer you on. But if you said it directly and explicitly, then you would be condemned as being immoral. And so so that's one of the things that happens in terms of those types of kids too, is that we see that tension where it's not good, but it happens so often. And it happens even to the point where we don't know the exact motivation, but priests begin to give children names because so many of them are born out of wedlock. And so culturally, it makes sense, because in ancient times, when a woman was pregnant, there was no pressure for her to marry. There was no pressure for her to marry. She did not have, even if she was a young woman and she was pregnant, she didn't have to marry the man who was the young boy who was the father of her baby. Because there was nothing wrong with, because life was life, life is precious. It doesn't have to be life that God has stamped approval to procreate on. Not at all. But then, so we see that loving and embracing still around, but then we also see the church in some ways affecting, so it's not good, right? You look down on some people will look down on those. But I find that oftentimes there was still an openness to it. And so for those types of women, the family would raise them. And sometimes those kids then get their family names from the fact that, from the race of whoever their father was. Familia in English, stuff like that. Or if you're familia in Pali, it means that your dad was a priest, and there was lots like that. So, so in Laura Souter's book, Daughters of the Island, which is the first big Chamorro feminist text, she struggles with that because on the one hand, women feeling empowered to just, and assertive and aggressive and strong enough to do something like that, it shows strength. But on the other hand, it's also unseemly. Socially it's looked down upon, right? Sexual labor. And so I remember in her book, she struggled with what to do about that, because on the one hand, it showed that Chamorro women were still proud of their bodies, that they were still confident in themselves, but it went against what the church was telling them how they had to live, right? Is that you don't do stuff like that. But so that's why people who came to Guam, sometimes they would describe like Chamorro girls as Santa Marias in church. They're like perfect. They pray the best. They're the most pure and innocent. And then once the sun goes down, then they're just good old Marys. And then they're down to enjoy life. They're excited about life. They're happy. And so, but the 1800s, by the time the 1900s has kind of been limited. But you would, because like in 1800, for example, Chamorro women would still go topless, many in the house, right? And around the farm. Like if you would not wear something on top. When you went into the village, when you went to church, you had to put something on. But Chamorro women were still largely comfortable going topless at that time. By the 1900s, no Chamorro woman would go topless anywhere. And by that time, there was a heavy culture of surveilling young women. The term Palawan Solan, comes about. And what Palawan Solan, now people have different explanations for where it comes from, but one explanation is that it refers to a woman of the road because women were not allowed to be on the road on their own by that time. You always had to be chaperoned, especially if you were young. If you were young, you couldn't be walking. So a woman who dared to walk by herself from place to place without escort, that was a Palawan Salan. You're a woman of the road. Look at you. What are you doing? A woman of the road can't be up to good. Is certainly up to no good. But you did still find examples of women who refused to marry and who would refuse to marry but would still have like children with lots of men. So I remember my great grandmother's sister was one of those where she had children with, she never married any of them. She had children with 4 different men over the course of her life. She never married any of them. And in fact, she also had 2 children with her brother-in-law, who was my great grandfather. And so she was a strong woman, and all these men were drawn to her, but she wouldn't marry any of them. Mm. And so one of her kids too was a governor. But and so there was still that strength and that confidence, but it was much more muted. Sorry, I gave you a lot of information. Sorry about that.
Again, I know it's late, but at some point, maybe in the future, I'm really curious to learn more about the Serena story and how that's in, or if that's a Spanish, where the story, because it really is about the relations between women, right? The young daughter who is doing what she wants to do and, gets in trouble, but also the godmother who intervenes, right? So let the part that belongs to me stay human, right? So I think the Serena story has always been very evocative to me, because in some ways it's about a young girl sort of charting her own path, right? But the tensions between the mother and the daughter, and the intervention of the god.
Oh yes.
And it's really hard to explain to Catholics who are not Chamorro the importance of the godmother. A godparent is like another parent, right? So I have godchildren who are Catholic, but they're not Chamorro, and I have to almost try to explain. It's like, no, I'm going to be in your life. I'm going to give you presents, and I expect you to call me auntie, not by my first name. None of this that stuff. That's not going to work for me. I know you weren't raised that way, but you're my godchild, so it's going to be Auntie Antoinette, right? Even if you were raised to call your aunts and uncles by their first name. So I don't know. I know it's kind of late, but just at some point, if you could tie that in, I'm really curious about the story.
So just generally, so the Serena legend, because there's different types of Chamorro legends. Mm-hmm. And so you have sort of the oldest types, which are still changed in certain ways, but they clearly come from ancient stories. They come from ancient stories, and then they've been adapted over time. And in fact, and then you have the ones that come in during the Spanish period, which are oftentimes European stories with Chamorro elements to them. Mm. Right? And so it's unclear. You have to unpack, like, is this a story that because the Serena stories are very different in most cultures compared to the one, but cultures will deal with it very differently. But then then a lot of the ones that we know about, they come in that where like a story heard from within the church or heard by whalers or people visiting Guam, and then Chamorros just kind of put their own spin on them. Mm-hmm. And so those are interesting because you can find how they want to put a Chamorro value into it, and you can definitely see that with the Serena story. With the Chamorro Serena story, is that it has the two main moral purposes of that story. 1, children obey your parents. 2, parents remember that you can hurt your children forever Chamorro, because one, and then, but what you're talking about, there's also that element there too, which is really nice. This idea that it is this something amongst women, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and I like that. And because I haven't heard people really explore that, but I can see that there would be a lot there in terms of, yeah, even if you sort of think about it, you could see the mother and the godmother as being sort of two different types of Chamorro womanhood at that time.
Mm.
One of them more fierce, judgmental, which is the one that comes primarily from the influence of Catholicism. If we can believe the accounts of the way that Chamorros raised their children, like from Fray Juan Pobre, they never yelled at them in anger. They never hit them. They guided their behavior by shame, by talking to them, by making sure they understood how they were affecting others. Wow, it sounds so civilized. But and so, but then you see that the godmother is of that type, where the godmother is like, this is still your daughter, you need to, but then the mother is the angry one, right? So it's almost like you could see those two roles, but those two roles sort of contradicting. One is sort of the angry Catholic mother, like they used to say, the angry Catholic father. Sort of sort of one thing that Chamorros used to say is, if you were like a really angry father, you had a Catholic, or excuse me, you had a Spanish temper. They used to say that you had a Spanish temper. And so, but yeah, so that's why I love those types of legends, because some of them are clearly like they have the same source material as Grimm's fairy tales, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you see like with the one version of Cinderella, Cinderella is shown by birds a place where she can have all of the money and live by herself and get away from her evil family. But Cinderella is a good person, and so she believes that even though her family has treated her bad, she has an obligation to share it with them. So she goes back to them to tell them that I have found this house, and money fall and gold coins fall from the sky, from the ceiling, whenever you open the door. And they like drag her back there, and they want to steal the house from her and stuff. And Cinderella opens the door, and the gold coins fall on her. But then when her stepmother opens the door to get the coins, hot tar falls on her and her daughter and kills them.
Mm.
And so I always found that to be interesting, where it's like Cinderella got her escape, but her family obligation still says, I need to go and I need to take care of my stepmom and my stepsister. But Timay Megosidos, they get what's coming to them in the end. And so, but no, you should definitely, that would be very cool to analyze Serena in that way. Why does it seem like the online Chamorro language? Because the future is Famalawan, eh? That's well, I can tell you that I'm very used to that, because Chamorro activist groups are female dominated nowadays. And so the only thing, and one reason why I'm very happy that my classes now are primarily female dominated, at least for the language, is because women used to carry the language, but in the past few generations there's been a shift where most of the young language speakers are male as opposed to female. And so it's very interesting. So that's why because when I was at UOG and we would try to have second language speaker events to promote second language learning, the majority of the younger speakers were almost always men. And so that's why, so that's always something that's fascinated me, is how is it that it went from the women primarily carrying the language and being the bearers of the language to then it's switching to where then men now sort of, at least younger men, speak the language more. But I think if you like, I think it has to do with Chamorro men, and not to speak for all Chamorro men, but I can definitely speak from my experience. Chamorro men are used to having very capable and strong women around them, taking care of lots of things for them. Chamorro men, we tend to be coddled. We tend to be babied a lot. And so, so when something's going on, right, Chamorro women are usually the ones that are more willing to show up to do something about it, whereas Chamorro men are very likely to wait for somebody else to fix it. It doesn't have to be like this. It doesn't have to be. But I think, I mean, I've just kind of noticed that because Chamorro men, there is this feeling traditionally, you know, that people cook for you, people take care of you, and stuff like that in the home. You know, you may work outside in the public sphere, but there is this expectation that in sort of the private sphere, you're supposed to be taken care of. Women have to be organizers in the home, but because they also have sort of this, you know, this Maga Hog drive in them too, it naturally spills out into the community too. This feeling of obligation, this feeling of need to sort of help the wider community. So that's one thing that I would see from that. Yeah, not that all Chamorro men are lazy. Setsu nai, setsu lahi. And so, Sidus Masi to all of you. And so I'm hoping that I can get my PowerPoint ready on time before next week. But I'm not going to tell you who it's going to be, though. I'm going to keep it a surprise every week.
Getting the first defense of a professor, you never tell the students what you were supposed to do. You always act like that's exactly what I planned to do. My lesson went the way, my lecture is exactly what I planned to say. They don't see your notes. The PowerPoint just don't say anything. It's supposed to be that way. They don't know.
Okay, I will use that approach next week.
I live by that, believe me, week in, week out. All right. Sidus Masi, that was so nice. Thank you so much, Miguel.
Hamzumas. Adios. Estaque.
Adios.
8 minute hit until next week. And Sidus Masi, Savina, and Travis.
Adios.